There's high magic and low magic. Low magic would be, how can I heal my cattle? How can I make sure that evil influences don't come to harm my house or my family? How can I change the weather so my crops don't wither? And then high magic is the transformation of self. Studies of highly effective people show when you do a study of their personality traits, you'll find at the heart of that range of traits that they exhibit is the ability to be open and the ability to be focused.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is the podcast about the deep values of the people shaping our common life. Every episode, I speak to someone who is speaking into our public conversations, but from a very wide range of different perspectives, professions, belief systems, political positions, and life experiences. My guest today is Philip Carr-Gomm, who is a psychologist, a therapist, and author of many books, including The Druid's Way, and for a long time, the leader of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. Philip, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm going to ask you a question which I'm going to guess won't throw you, as it sometimes throws some guests, which is, what is sacred to you?
Aha. Trees are sacred to me, amongst many other things, but trees are really important to me as objects of reverence and beings deserving of reverence and love. And the bottom line is all of life is sacred to me.
How does I'd love to just hear more about trees. How does the fact that you hold trees as sacred show up in your decisions and your day-to-day life?
Yes, well, at one level, it's kind of not rational. I suppose, we have particular...
That's fine.
Particular affinities, don't we, with certain animals and certain plants and so on. And for me, trees speak to me. So that emotional level. So it's a bit like asking, why are you in love, or why do you love that one person over another? It's not explainable. I can start to analyze it and say there's something about the way trees are anchored in the earth that speaks to me of connection with the land, of the importance of sort of being anchored, of the value of the unconscious, connecting with the unconscious, and what cannot be seen, because the tree is anchored in what cannot be seen deep down in the earth, and it's drawing from a sort of secret source. This sort of moisture it's drawing. So it's depicting this sense that I have that I need to draw from a source deep within in order to flourish in the world. And then there's something about the trunk. There are tall, majestic trees that help me to feel upright. These sort of concepts of integrity and uprightness and upstandingness and all those sort of concepts. But even bowed trees, even a lovely weeping willow, or a tree that's half fallen over, there's a sort of dignity in that as well, which is the dignity you see in old people, who may be bowed, but nevertheless are dignified. And then, of course, the crown of the trees, the way you get these wonderful sort of, the bright green and in the early spring, and then the blue sky behind them, and this sort of connection with the sky and the stars and the sun, and a wonderful sense of connection to sort of higher things, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Inspiration from on high and so on. So it's a very powerful, strong, and then it's all in a living being. It's not just a symbol. This is actually a being that is alive.
Yes. Do you have one favorite tree?
Well, there's a yew tree just near. I live in Lewes in Sussex, and there's a yew tree in Wilmington just down the road by the Long Man, this wonderful old chalk hill figure, and this tree is at least 1,600 years old. And so there's a church that's almost 1,000 years old right next to it. And I just find it extraordinary that this tree was probably 700 years old when they were building that church. So there's this lovely sense of sort of ancientness, and it's bowed over. It's so old that it's sort of keeling over, and it's supported by various props. Sort of props
Yes.
support it. But as a result, it's like a sort of river. It's very red. The bark is very red. So there's this sort of red river of life flowing up. It's just fantastic.
Gorgeous. Well, I know yews have particular meaning in Druidry, and I'm sure we'll come back to the relationship between Druidry and Christianity. But first, I want to just get a sense of your story. Tell me a little bit about young Philip. In your childhood, were there any big ideas in there that were particularly formative, political or philosophical or religious? What was shaping you as you were, say, primary school age?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Notting Hill Gate. My father ran a history magazine that he had started, and that would have one article in every edition about the future. So it was called Past and Future. That was the name of the magazine. And because he ran it from home, the house often had very interesting visitors and people who were writing articles and books and so on. And one of his friends was the old chief Druid, Ross Nichols, and so he was always coming around the house. And my dad seemed to know lots of people who were interested in spiritual things. He knew the founder of the Buddhist Society in London, a QC called Christmas Humphreys, and various other people. And yet he himself he was an agnostic, and he wasn't interested in spirituality really. But the house was full of these books and magazines and people that were interested in these things. So that was a strong influence. And then prior to the age of 11, I can't remember too much about my childhood, just little glimpses here and there. But I read a book called The Life of the Buddha, very lyrical book, when I was 11. And it just absolutely sort of switched the lights on in the house. It was suddenly, this is the only game in town worth playing. The task of seeking enlightenment is the only thing worth, And
age 11.
I know. It does seem very young now, but I read that book, The Life of the Buddha, and The Lord of the Rings, and I met the old chief Druid for the first time. So sort of a lot happened in that. And funnily enough, I've talked to a number of people in the training program that I helped to develop with the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. People write in reviews of their experience at the end of each year. And so you'll get a review at the end of their third level of training, which sort of reviews their whole life, really. It's really very fascinating, tremendous privilege to read them. And you often find that around that time of sort of puberty, something seems to happen. And it was certainly the case for me. So those were the influences. There was the Buddha, Lord of the Rings, Sherlock Holmes, for some reason, was very, very influential, reading Sherlock Holmes. And those were the sort of influences.
And if I had met you age 14, paint a very brief picture of your school, and perhaps what 3 words would your schoolmates have used to describe you?
So I went to Westminster School. So I was very lucky. Like every day I was sitting in Westminster Abbey, miming to the hymns, I'm embarrassed to say, because there was this, I don't know where it came from, but there was this thing like, to be cool, you made no effort. There was some strange kind of thing. I don't know whether that's a public school
still
thing.
Stands. Yeah.
Yeah, to be cool, you don't be seen to be making an effort to do anything. And so, and don't sing along to the hymns. That was where I was. But nevertheless, a part of me really loved being in Westminster Abbey every morning. The stained glass windows, the music. That was an influence. But the school itself, the lessons had absolutely no interest for me whatsoever. But I was really lucky in my prep school and in my whatever they call it, the next school along, there was one teacher who was incredibly, really good. I can still remember their names. Mr. Dawson, the English teacher in my prep school, he encouraged me to write. And then he even, I think I must have told him about reading the book on the Buddha. And so he got me to give a lecture to the class on Buddhism. So I remember sitting, this little sort of 11-year-old boy, or perhaps I was 12 by then, burning sticks of incense with a Buddha figure on the desk, talking to them about Buddhism. So that sort of public speaking thing. And funnily enough, the only school play I was in was as a psychoanalyst. I had to put on stick on a false beard and pretend to be a psychoanalyst in a school play. And they wanted me to smoke a pipe, and this would never happen now, would it? But in those days, they wanted me to smoke a pipe full of tobacco.
A real pipe.
A real pipe. And of course, I was so nervous, I couldn't strike the match and light it because it requires some degree of calm to do that. So I never got it alight. But those themes of this interest in psychology and spirituality started really early, and they've never left me. I mean, those are the two main interests that have just have preoccupied me for my life, really.
So how come you're known as a Druid and not a Buddhist?
Because although I was interested in Buddhism, when I was 16, I became very interested in Rosicrucianism, the kind of Christian mystical esoteric tradition of Rosicrucianism, and studied that from around 16. But I also asked the chief druid if I could study with him. So I started visiting his house and studying with him from the age of 16.
Do you mind if I interrupt, Philip? What is a chief druid? What does it... Well, I feel like I've got loads of baggage and assumptions around it, but I don't actually know.
Well, I mean, it's just the leader of a group.
Okay.
That's all it means. Yeah, that's what it means. Okay. Druidry captivated me, at that early age because I read some of the things my Druid teacher had written about trees, about, Robert Graves. He knew Robert Graves, who wrote The White Goddess, which was a very seminal book published at, the end of the war, 45, 46 or so, which had this tremendous influence on the feminist movement and on the sort of the pagan movement in general, and to some extent in the sort of literary world as well. And my teacher had written essays about trees, which I found very inspiring and poetic. So I asked to study with him. And I continued my interest in the Dharmic traditions, and I became very interested. I read about Buddhism over the coming sort of years and decades, but when I discovered Jainism, that really lit a sort of a candle in me, and I dived into Jainism and used to go to North London and study with some Jain nuns. This was just about 10 years ago, and even began an MA in Jainism and so on, because that interested me so much. Lots of links with Buddhism and Hinduism, but it's on really working with the shared roots of the Dharmic traditions with Druidism, that I realized that you don't have to make a choice, that they actually draw the very interesting thing about the Druid tradition in these islands and Ireland and, parts of France and possibly going down to Spain as well and Portugal, is that these extraordinary similarities between the Dharmic traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, and particularly Hinduism. And this comes from our shared origin, our shared Indo-European origins, which was really discovered in the sort of 17th century onwards, looking at linguistic analysis and looking at the extraordinary connections between Old Irish and Sanskrit, and seeing the similarities, and the similarities in the stories and the myths and so on. And so for a long time, we've had a project with people involved in the Dharmic traditions called the One Tree Gathering, and the little sort of byline.
I'm sorry, Philip. I feel like I'm going to spend this whole interview asking you to explain things that seem very obvious, but I think of Dharmic as is implied by what you said, of kind of the thing that holds together Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism and possibly other things. How do you define that word?
Well, the Dharmic traditions specifically mean Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And then Sikhism becomes rather interesting because, like any category we humans invent, there's always one that doesn't quite fit, but is hovering on the edge,
But what does Dharma mean?
Dharma means, teaching, I think, way, spiritual way,
Right.
really.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you mind if I ask because you were sitting in Westminster Abbey every day, and you can. I'm unoffendable as someone who's broadly shaped by the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
What was it about the Dharmic traditions and then Druidry that felt like you wanted to move towards them? And what the sort of very dominant Christian story that you were sitting within, which just didn't feel like that was the direction you wanted to head in. Do you know what was going on?
Yes. I think with Christianity, I think there were three things that pushed me away from it. One was my dad's very strong rejection of it. He had a little slim book, which was, I can't remember what it was called, but it was like the Atheist's Bible. And it was a collection of horrendous biblical quotes. You know, the way you can go through the Bible and find, we shall smite all their heads off and, do all sorts of awful things. And I remember getting into trouble at prep school by carrying it with me and reading it out to the boys.
Your poor teachers.
Yes. So he was very adamant. He was very aware of the iniquities of Christianity, of the sort of the body count, I suppose you could say, to put it.
Yeah.
So I was familiar with the dark history of Christianity, the Inquisition and the Crusades and so on. And so the three influences that pushed me away were that, the fantastically boring presentation of Christianity in a prep school by a sort of RE teacher, you can imagine that, and beyond. Yeah. And then what was the third reason? I can't remember now. What I found with Buddhism, when I read about Buddhism, is that the stories, the kind of ambience that it created of calm and equanimity, and being seated, the key image of a sage being seated under a tree gaining enlightenment, as opposed to this key image of somebody being crucified on a tree, on a cross. One was so obviously appealing, the other one was so problematic for me. Oh, I know. The third influence was a very early memory. I have only few memories when I was young. I just remember we lived in a place called Courtfield Gardens in Kensington, and I remember being with a nanny in a pram or pushchair, saying, and we were going past, and I just had my memory is of this big church, and of her saying, "We must hurry before God locks us out of the park." That was
wow.
There was this association with this sort of Jehovah figure who would keep us locked out of him, away from, I don't know. So unfortunately, yes, I've since had very beautiful experiences of Christianity in various contexts. But those were the sort of predominant influences which led me towards feeling at home in Buddhism. And the stories in Christianity, they're sort of set in a Middle Eastern backdrop, as it were, just so they don't appeal to me. Sort of deserts and palm trees and dates and things. They're just not. Whereas India, when I've been to India, I just love India. And I can imagine having a past life in India, and I can't imagine having a past life in the Holy Land. It's just like an affinity that I have,
Yeah. So I know that Druidry is kind of non-exclusive in that sense. So it's not that you rejected Buddhism to become a Druid, but it is kind of your key identity. What was the decision point? What was yes, this is the spiritual path that I'm going to commit my life to?
Well, I didn't. I'm not sure I would say commit my life to. I mean, obviously, looking back, I've spent.
This is me using definitely Christian-coded language. I apologize.
Yes, that's right. Because I didn't. I've always sort of rebelled against labels and boxes and classifications, and so I spent the entire 32 years that I was the chief of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, which was the sort of title. I spent those entire 32 years trying to think of another term for what I was doing, because I didn't like chief. It sounded so kind of, I don't know, patriarchal and sort of strange to me.
Wait, did you become the chief druid? Is that what happened?
Yes, that's right.
Oh, I see. You danced around it.
And then so in transactional analysis, which is a school of psychotherapy, you have this sort of concept of top dog and underdog, in the way we naturally fall, in a sort of hierarchical way we all relate to each other.
Yeah.
Someone's naturally top dog. And if you're a CEO or a chief, you're immediately top dog and so on.
Yeah.
So likewise with Druid, I mean, I used to question whether, do we need to use this term? Because the problem with words is like terms like Druid is you immediately have a set of thoughts around it. If you spoke to anybody, you said, well, what comes to mind? And you might say Stonehenge, sacrifice, I don't know, mistletoe. And of course, it's not really like that. So yes, I wouldn't say I committed to it. But it's of all the sort of spiritualities I've explored, it's the one that I've tended to sort of stay with and bring other strands of influence into.
So you're really helping me see why I've slightly struggled to get hold of what it is. I've been reading your work and immersed in this world, and on the website of the Order of Bards, it says things like free of dogma and inclusive, and sort of inherent is the thing. It feels like you can almost bring whatever you want into it.
Yes.
But I would love to know kind of what does it mean for you to be a druid or to follow the way of Druidry?
Yes. And what is particular about it, I think, as well, because you can say that if it's that, if I said something like, well, it's a nature spirituality that welcomes all religious faiths, so it's quite possible to be a Christian druid or a Buddhist druid, and you can. Some people take it as a philosophy, some people understand it as a religion, some people treat it as a way of life, and so on. That can all sound very vague, can't it? But so if you then say, well, what's particular about it? One particularity, which I absolutely love, is its love of trees. That for Druids, trees are absolutely central. One of the classical writers, I think it was Tacitus, said, the trees are the center of their whole religion. So there's a way in which the tree is an extremely important being, symbol, spirit for us. And I don't know of another. I know that trees play important parts in other religions and ways. For instance, the Buddha gained enlightenment under a Bodhi tree. The Mahavira in Jain tradition gained enlightenment under a tree as well, and so on. But Druidry places the tree as a very central figure, and that's one thing. And then the second thing is the way Druidry brings art and nature together. And there's an aspect of Druidry, the bardic tradition in Druidry, and in most Druid rituals and ceremonies, there will be music and song and poetry and storytelling and so on. So that, and rather than a separation being seen between culture and nature, which tends to happen, we tend to associate culture and art with the urban, the sophisticated, the educated, and nature is wild and free, and we see art as an integral part of nature, and that our human nature is to be artistic and creative. So those are two sort of central features of it. But another definition to try and get more of a sort of handle on it would be to say that it's today it's a eclectic spirituality that draws its inspiration from the Druids of the past, the pre-Christian tradition that celebrates our being in the natural world, and
It's one of the things I've really valued about your work. One of the things that does, and it's another word I'd love you to define for me, actually, esoteric. But one of the things that has always slightly sort of faintly amused me about the esoteric world or parts of the pagan world, in which I have some very dear friends and brush up against the edges of, is, and the thing is, I think we all do this, it's a very human nature, is the desire to go, we are an unbroken lineage, right? You know, we are the ancient wisdom.
Yes,
Your wisdom is less ancient than our wisdom.
Yes.
And actually, from what I gather from your work, there's very patchy evidence, right, of what Druidry meant or looked like in these islands and in, you know, parts of France. And maybe I'm wrong. Say more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are little pieces of evidence so you've got the evidence from the classical writers. So you can say, for instance, you know, the classical writers who were contemporaneous with the Druids, the ancient Druids, said that the Druid, you know, they believed in reincarnation. So we can say, okay, that's, you know, many Druids will believe in reincarnation, for instance.
Right.
But otherwise, there's very little. There's little sort of hints from the archaeology and a bunch of hints from the classical writers. And then you have this gap of about 1,000 years until the period of the Druid revival, sort of 17th century onwards, where scholars became interested again in it. So it has, modern Druidry has a recorded history of about 300 years, which in itself is a sort of substantial amount of time. But as you say, that desire to sort of prove one's credentials has been so strong that it's led to lots of sort of what we say fake news, I suppose you'd say now, wouldn't you? Not quite correct information and fantasy and so on. What interests me is I go to the psychology behind it. You know, I'm not a historian, and I find history quite frustrating because of the lack of it. You know, it's like being a detective with not quite enough information to nail your perpetrator. You know, there's never quite enough. You know, and so I'm interested in the dynamics of it. So take as an example, Bards, Ovates and Druids, which is the name of this Druid group that I've been involved in. So you have the classical writers talking. I think it was Strabo who talked about, you know, the Bards, the Ovates and the Druids, these three schools of in the ancient times. And then this idea was seized upon by Yolomouganuk, who was very involved in the revival period. Bards, Ovates and Druids. And then historians will say...
I'm going to hit my emergency stop button again.
Yes.
I feel like I can guess what a bard is, and we're getting towards what Druid is. Very briefly, what's an ovate?
What's an ovate? An ovate is a seer, a diviner, a healer. So the idea is, yes. So Bards, Ovates and Druids.
They sound cool.
Yeah. No, they're all very cool, and basically, you see, the historians will get caught up in, you know, did Strabo really know what he was talking about, and you know what exactly is he referring to, and you know how did he know because he was in France or something, but to me that speaks immediately. And what I've seen over the years with thousands of people who've done our trainings, is that in virtually all of us, there's a part of us that wants to be creative, the bard. You know, to sing the song of our souls, to be creative, to be, you know, and we all want to develop that potential. So there's the bardic school. And then the Ovate school is, well, you know, lots of us want to be close to nature and to see beyond the veil of time and to sort of penetrate the mysteries and to be of use in the world, to, you know, the whole healing, being interested in healing oneself and healing other people and so on. And then the Druid, the sage, the part of us that seeks sort of inner wisdom. You know, one of the things I've learned is that all the stress in the past on the inner child that we've all become very familiar with in the last sort of 20 years, that lots of people experience the inner old person. When I've done informal surveys, I've said, you know, have you ever been aware of the inner old person? And lots of people say, yes, from when I was a kid. I always sensed a sort of much older, kind of wiser person deep inside. Did you ever have that? Did you ever sort of sense an inner old person?
Sadly, no.
No. I'm sure. I mean, some people do that. I don't know. Yeah.
Where are you?
Where are you? Yes. But I think those are three. So what interests me is, how can I develop the sage, the part of me that wants to be wise, to find wisdom? You know, the philosophy. That's where the whole study of philosophy comes into play. And what's the part of me that wants to be closer to nature and to heal and be of use? And what is the part of me that is the bard, that wants to be poetic? and to give to the world, be creative in the world. And they're all stimulated by these currents in Druidry.
Yes. I mean, as I was trying to get kind of and the thing is, as I was doing this, I was arguing with myself because I was like, why do you feel the need to pin it to the wall? This is the bit that you are resistant to in spirituality, that we want to make a system and a list of dogmas. But I was genuinely trying to understand, and the kind of the practices of celebrating the 8 festivals of the year around the solstices and the equinoxes and harvest and Lunasa and Samhain and all these words that sound kind of like esoteric and interesting. But you mentioned seers and diviners, and there is something that comes up in your work, which is this idea of magic. And I had a really interesting conversation with a woman called Dr. Kate Thomas, who is... she describes herself in various different ways, but we talked a little bit about magic. And one of the phrases that have come across in you is wielding the magic wand. And I know that like wands and staffs and the symbolism of that are big. But could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that word, how it shows up in Druidry, or more broadly?
Yeah. Well, studies of highly effective people, what is sometimes called in psychology self-actualized people who are very sort of effective and creative in the world and get stuff done and so on, show when you do a study of their personality traits, you'll find at the heart of that range of traits that they exhibit, at the heart is the ability to be open and the ability to be focused. So 2 apparently very contradictory traits. The ability to be open to new thoughts, new ideas, new experiences, new feelings, and so on. And also the ability to be really focused in order to achieve objectives and so on. And that is essentially what magic is. And that's, so you talked about the wand and the staff. That's, if you like, the capacity we all have to be linear, to be able to aim for something, to be able to be goal-oriented towards deciding what we want and so on. And then the other is the ability that's depicted in Druidry and other things by the chalice, the grail. So you've got Excalibur and the grail. So symbolically, they're symbolized by the yin and yang you'd use in the sort of Taoist terminology. So one way of understanding magic is saying, what if you could develop the ability to be able to modulate really well between your ability to work with a chalice, to be open, receptive, and to be directive and linear in a way, such a way as to achieve change in the world. And magic is just a way of talking about how you achieve change in the world. So you could say, I could give you a piece of jewelry now, and you would say, what's this? And I'd say, it's the result of magic. And you'd say, what does that mean? You say, well, it was a thought in somebody's mind, and they managed to make it real, and here it is in front of you now. So the question about like how do I do magic is how do I create in the world, really? It's another way of talking about creativity, you could say.
That is not most people's association with it.
Well, we could go on and start to analyze that, and you can talk about other forms of magic. I do a sort of online course called Lessons in Magic, and I start with exactly this question: what is magic? And I look at all the different ways people understand magic, and then we drop them into categories, and just as an example, there's high magic and low magic. For instance, low magic would be, how can I heal my cattle? How can I make sure that evil influences don't come to harm my house or my family? How can I change the weather so my crops don't wither and so on? So it's actually, doing specific acts. And then high magic is the transformation of self. How can I become a vessel of the divine? How can I transform myself to become more accomplished and more skilled at whatever I want to be skilled at, and so on.
Yes. There's so many threads in there that I want to pick up, but I'm going to try and be brave and talk about the one that I'm not sure how to talk about well, which is, like, just to put it straightforwardly, and I think this is from reading your book, the other thing that the chalice and the staff represent.
Yes.
They're a penis and a womb.
Yes.
And I would love to hear you talk about, and again, in the current climate, all of this language is contested, and I'm probably going to upset someone by saying it. But let's say gender or maleness and femaleness, that much more so than other spiritualities or religions that I have spent any time in, as far as I could see from this very first contact, that this idea of the masculine energy and feminine energy, the like, you said at some point, you said something like the collective voice of the male soul. And you also said humanity divorced from the feminism is shattered and divided.
Divorced from the feminine.
Yes, the feminine. And, you know, one of your books, The Druidry, which is from 1993, so you may have completely changed your mind on all of this.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a big section on the long man and where the long man's penis is, or phallus, whatever you prefer. I know that's a big thing in psychoanalysis. Yes. And maybe actually, was there a partner? Maybe the long man is in fact a woman. What does that mean for how we should engage with the earth?
Yeah.
Could you, and I really don't mean this in a gotcha, I don't mean to lead you into dangerous territory. So we can talk afterwards about how comfortable we are with what you said, and we won't put anything out that you're like, oh, that's going to get me into trouble. But I would love to hear about that element of your spirituality or druidry and understand it better.
Yes, no, that's a really interesting subject, and you're right that it's very sensitive. I mean, we've had to the sort of teaching course that we have comprises sort of 3 levels, and it's delivered online and also sort of printed material, and we've had various revisions of it, and you know, and the latest revision of it has been. Have been sort of non-binary people looking at all the texts and saying, you know, this is problematic for us, and isn't there another way you can say this, and so on. And we've had sort of endless discussions about this and so on. So you notice how when I talked about magic and I talked about Excalibur and the Grail, I didn't mention gender in it. You know, I was talking about, no, that's right. But
pushing you.
Yes, I was very deliberate. You know, I avoided that. And well, I didn't avoid it actually, because when I was talking about the dynamics, these are, you know, openness and directiveness. You see, the problem is, as soon as you bring gender into it, you know, for instance, I could have said, you know, the chalice, the grail, the feminine quality, and you know, or the directive masculine quality. That immediately suggests that if a woman, for instance, is able to be willful or think in a linear way, these are somehow male characteristics that she's adopting. You know, so it is problematic. The concepts of yin and yang are quite useful, because you can talk about sort of yang energy and the dance between yin and yang, and it's sort of one step removed from saying masculine and feminine. As soon as you drop into using masculine and feminine, you run the risk of offending people or appearing to be binary. But I think there's no doubt that you were saying, you know, had I changed my views since 1993? Well, in that particular piece that you read out, I was talking about this extraordinary prophecy of Merlin that was written, where he talks about this goddess figure who has a city she walks for. It's such a powerful image, I find, walking with a city in one hand, a little miniature city in one hand, and a forest in the other. And it's, you know, this, you know, and, you know, and she talks about, I've forgotten what it is now, but it's deeply sad. And it speaks to our present situation. She talks about the rivers being polluted. And, you know, she's looking into the future and being a sort of Cassandra figure, you know. And there is a way, I think, that regardless of any kind of evolution or changes we've made in our understanding of gender, I think there is a way in which you can contact the male, the male soul, you know, the female soul of the world, if you like. They are collective. If you think about the concept of the collective unconscious, you know, that we're all influenced by and connected to and is a part of us, there is definitely a sort of a male collective psyche, in my opinion and experience. And so yes, so I think the problem with talking about it in terms of sort of penis and vagina or womb is that you make the analogy so direct that whilst it's, you know, it's really helpful. I mean, I think it's fine as long as you then sort of move beyond it. You know, you say that there is, anyway.
Thank you.
Was that of some help? I don't know.
Yes, I wondered how you'd be navigating it, because it does, in some ways it feels like the divine feminine, or this idea that there might be a goddess, is what draws a lot of women towards these more revealed, not revealed, sorry, you make a distinction between earth religions and revealed religions, more these more kind of earth-based spiritualities, might be paganism, like all of these categories are. And I know quite a lot of men for whom the kind of, they call it mythopoetic. There's a particular, like, the masculine soul, the like coming to terms with what does it mean to be a man, that has been present in Druidry, has been part of what they've been drawn to. And I wondered how you, sort of institutionally in some ways, navigate that bit of your heritage and tradition without losing the power of it, and acknowledging that there are ways that those concepts can be very spiky for people, and inhospitable and misused.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that's interested me with Druidry is that it seems to attract as many men as it does women. So one of the things is, you know, because I've been sort of speaking and giving workshops in this sort of new age alternative spirituality world for the last 40 years or so. So I've been in lots of different kind of events and all the rest of it. And it's quite common for there to be more women than men. I mean, I've given workshops where, you know, there'll be 20 women and one man or something like that. Very common. But what struck me about Druid events is they tend to be sort of 50-50, which is rather interesting. So there is a way in which it seems to speak to men as much as women. But we also have a big, you know, gay and also trans community involved in Druidry too, which I find very heartening as well, because it really does show how it speaks to so many different people. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if part of it is that the sort of archetype, maybe we could talk about the archetype of a druid is a mat race. So I wanted to say, like, these were my associations before beginning to learn about Druidry. Yeah. And I'm sure they're the same as everybody's. Merlin, you know, the solstice at Stonehenge.
Yes.
Mistletoe, magic. That's about it.
Yeah.
That's really unhelpfully ignorant. And I heard a colleague of you, I can't remember which one, going through a list of like the various, like there's the evil druid, there's the like lovely, gentle, come back to the earth druid. Yeah. What of the kind of public narratives about Druidry would you want to encourage, and which ones are you constantly myth-busting around?
Oh, yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, the one that I'd encourage is that sort of open... I mean, the image that comes to mind is a photo of sunrise on the sort of summer solstice sunrise on Glastonbury Tor, with lots of people sitting on Glastonbury Tor, all sort of children and colourfully dressed and just ordinary people, as it were, just everyday folk, all sitting on the hill. And that's Druidry to me, as opposed to the photograph we might think of lots of bearded men in white robes at Stonehenge. You know, I think that the myth busting is getting less and less so, but I think it's generally that it's a male preserve. But luckily, I mean, things have changed so much in the last sort of 30 years or so that I think generally, you know, thanks to the internet, I suppose people can pretty quickly find out what druids are and what they look like, and watch films and Google them and so on. You know. Yes.
And I'd love to just think with you a little bit about the relationship between Druidry and Christianity. And I think that's the other part of the archetype, isn't it? That Druids were here before the Christians came, and Christians stomped them all out, which I'm sure there was some of that going on. I remember, this is probably showing my age, but for lots of people, our early imaginations were formed by the mists of Avalon.
Yes.
Like the Arthurian the beautiful Arthurian landscape in which the kind of like ancient earth religions were the underdog, getting crushed beneath the heel. And that you were very careful in your writings of what I've heard to not draw too strong a binary. Not to say we Druids understand things and these other religions, they, to do that tribal move, which I really appreciate. But if you could, there's something around sacrifice, at least, like and you talked about the figure of Christ on the cross and it not being appealing to you. If there are different intuitions or different sensibilities, maybe particularly around that topic, but any way you want to take it, how would you describe those particularities?
Yes.
That's a very poorly framed question. Forgive me.
No, that's okay. No, it's a really interesting question. I've put together a book called Seek Teachings Everywhere, where I took a number of essays I'd written on Druidry and Christianity and sort of put them together with some other essays on Druidry and Jainism and Druidry and Wicca. And really in those I was trying to explore exactly this sort of question. And there are indeed Christians who are Druids. There's a lovely church in the forest in Brittany, which I visit often. Which they're Christians, but they're Druids as well, and they do the most beautiful services in this wooden church.
So how does that work?
Well, they use a very early, I think it's 6th century, if I'm right, Irish mass that they found in a manuscript in Geneva. It's called the Celtic Orthodox Church, and they're Druids too, And but
what makes them Druids as well? I'm so sorry, I'm being a right idiot about this. But is it because they celebrate their 8 festivals of the year? Is it about a commitment? What makes them Druids as well?
Yeah. Yes. Well, they're first and foremost Christians.
Yeah.
And then, but they have, the way you notice it is they have this little Arwen sign, these 3 bars of light, which is a Druid sign, on some of their icons in the church. And in the graveyard in the forest, there's a beautiful Celtic cross with an Arwen in the middle of it. So you say to them, you've got this Druid symbol. And they say, yes, well, we are Druids too. And I'm not sure exactly how they'd articulate the way their Druidry flows in it. But I think, one of the ways that where Druidry and Christianity combine, there's a movement there is a movement still, I think, called the Forest Church, which was created by, I think, some people who joined the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, and then they found their Christianity was kind of revivified by, if I remember correctly, which I may not, but was sort of by Druidry. And they started a movement called the Forest Church, which was basically holding church services outdoors in the forest. But the idea of the divine child is something that exists in Druidry as well as, that's a really good sort of meeting point between the two. There's this concept of the Mabon, the divine child within, which I'm hesitating because this is, all these topics are sort of vast and you can dive into them and then we'll be here for an hour, But yeah, there are points of connection, I think. Some people even say, for instance, that the doctrine of the Trinity comes from St. Hilary of Poitiers, who was in the 6th century, and he was actually a Druid. The evidence suggests he was a Druid and then he became a Christian, and that he brought with him the Druids' love of trios. They have the triads, these sort of wisdom sayings in threes, and that because you don't find the doctrine of the Trinity within the Bible, and it was introduced by St. Hilary, they think, there you go. There's a bit of influence from Druidry and Christianity.
Wow. And around the concept of sacrifice, it felt to me like, because it is, you're right, it's one of the things, like particularly human sacrifice, right? When we tell the story of like the ancient evil pagan Druids, like sacrificing on a slab. But my instinct from your book is you were trying to draw a bit of a distinction there and say, yes, sacrifice is at the heart of Christianity. It's not so much at the heart of Druidry. Have I understood that right?
Yeah,
Understood
yes,
that right?
that's. I think that's fair to say that sacrifice isn't. It's not a strong theme. I mean, you could sort of argue a case for saying, you sacrifice a preoccupation with the material gain for a love of nature and so on. But no, sacrifice isn't a theme in Druidry, really.
I think I'm probably reading more into it than that's there. There are points where it's felt like there's a hostility to the idea, and I'm wondering if I'm seeing that in other bits of paganism, like almost like the self-flagellatory tendencies of extreme versions of Christianity are a bit offensive to people with more earth-based religions.
Yeah, yes, I would think so, because it relates, also to the relationship with sexuality. I think that one of the sort of impulses that sort of motivated, I think, the whole sort of pagan resurgence and all the rest of it was a kind of desire to sort of to celebrate and to sort of own sexual desire rather than separating it out and saying that we must overcome this. So and it's almost like, some place I wrote something about how it's almost like we need post-Freudian religions. And what I meant by that is, despite the fact that he was bonkers in many ways, our friend Sigmund, who I have some finger puppets, which I always want to. Despite the fact that and again, we could dive into why I think he was bonkers.
You're going to tell. Why don't you make the point you're about to make as if
with it? Yes, exactly. Yes. I'm afraid some of your ideas, Sigmund, are pretty lunatic. Penis envy for women, and so on. But the one thing that he really brought to our, collective awareness was the dangers of the repression of sexuality. And, the story of the church and the churches and the sort of sexual abuses that occurred within it are so shocking that you have to sort of call into question, what is it about Christian dogma that has led to that? And it's partly something about that relationship with the body. And so I think part of the pagan revival and part of perhaps the energy in Druidry as well, or the interest in Druidry is how can I have a spirituality? How can I express my spiritual desires without repressing my sexuality and including, sort of holistic, post-Freudian, integrated approach. And so I think that's so the any kind of negativity you might have sort of picked up in the writings is something, could be something around that reaction to the relationship between Christianity and sexuality, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to do a cheeky two-part question to try and bring us into land and honour your time, if that's okay. And the first is, we're beginning to see in the data, we think, a kind of uptick of interest in Christianity in the UK. My guess is there is also an uptick in interest in spirituality more generally, and perhaps particularly these earth religions. So you were talking about the climate crisis in 1993, right? One thing you can strongly say about Druidry is it has been aware of kind of ecological overreach for a lot longer than lots of the wisdom traditions. If, as my hypothesis is, we're going to see an increased interest in both Christianity and various forms of earth religions, paganism, Druidry, all of those kind of things, and given that I don't believe, they are points of commonality, but I'm not sure they're like 100% reconcilable, right? I think there are some truth claims which are different, right? They have different stances on the world. What might help us continue to treat each other as fully human, to have as much as respect as we can gather for each other's traditions, to listen well? How do we stop this becoming another moment of like a tribal divide and instead let it help us all grow up our souls?
Yes, because of course, just interfaith dialogue on its own, I don't think does the trick.
It's really boring.
Yeah, really boring. And you're sort of preaching to the converted on your side of the house, as it were, and then the other lot are preaching to the converted on their side of the house. So I mean...
And you've spent so much time on the commonalities and just don't mention the fact that there's some things that actually really clash.
Yes, so I think my sense is there's a concept in psychotherapy which is where you sit with the discomfort. It's a very powerful, very simple idea that when we sit around the kitchen table with a cup of tea to talk about our problems with our friends naturally want to lift us out from our pain, offer solutions, help us feel better. Whereas the psychotherapist, although that's their goal in the end, doesn't do that, but actually encourages you to sit with the pain, because there's something in that pain that holds a secret for you. The way out is the way through, or the various ways of talking about it. So I think what would be very interesting would be a different kind of, this is just coming to me as I speak, a different kind of interfaith dialogue where one focuses on real bones of contention. And rather than trying to find points of similarity, actually sit with those differences and sort of breathe into them and give them some space and see what comes out of that. That would be rather an interesting exercise, I think.
Wow. On that very generative note, Philip Carr-Gomm, thank you so much for speaking to me on The Sacred.
It's been a pleasure.
The first thing that really stood out for me in this interview is the strangeness of Philip's childhood. He said this line: the chief druid was always coming over. All kinds of people in my house. And Philip went to Westminster School, which is set within the grounds of Westminster Abbey, right? And so did Dr. Timothy Winter, who I interviewed not that long ago, who converted to Islam later in life. And he speaks about a moment, and I imagine they're kind of close contemporaries, where there's this incredibly lively kind of intellectual, artistic, quasi-bohemian world for some of those London families that were sending their kids to that school. And just the strangeness of maybe the reason more people aren't Druids is not everyone has the chief Druid coming to their house all the time. The other thing, or rather the next thing that stood out to me, is this image that he gave of seated versus crucified. And if we think of the iconography of Buddhism and the iconography of Christianity, you've got a picture of a Buddha under a tree, I think. I'm now there's lots of images of this, but the key ingredient is seated Buddha. He's usually under a tree, I think. And then in Christianity, you have Christ on a cross. Interestingly, this whole conversation made me think about trees in my own tradition. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's a lot of talk of Jesus being hung on a tree, right? The fact that it is a wooden cross is not insignificant in the symbology and in the story. And then there's a lot about trees in Revelation at the end of the world, the trees that will be for the healing of the nations. But the kind of contrasting that he did between seated and crucified, I do think he's putting his finger on something quite deep in the spirit or the lived experience or the posture or just the texture of these two different traditions. That a very strong thread in Buddhism is this desire for inner peace, right? The removal of suffering. To come to a calm and steady and detached mind or mental state. I'm sure I'm butchering some of those phrases, so apologies, Buddhists, feel free to gently correct me. Whereas in Christianity, it's not that peace is not a theme. My peace I leave you, my peace I give you, is one of the things that Jesus said. But he's right that the reckoning with suffering as part of the human condition is a much stronger theme. That I don't know that Christianity's the kind of center of gravity of my tradition would ever claim that suffering is avoidable. So it's something that we have to work out how to be renewed by rather than shrunk by, right? Let it move us towards each other and to God rather than away from God and in on ourselves. And so I can totally see why this picture of a crucified man, a bleeding, dying man, which for many Christians is a very beautiful image of the self-giving love of God, could also be just horrifying and off-putting, and a seated Buddha much more appealing. We really, I really didn't mean it as a gotcha in terms of the kind of male-female stuff in Druidry. It just really stood out in his book in a way that wasn't yet coming through in the conversation that we had. And it's really interesting that he also is drawing on Jungian thought. I think I need to go and read more Jung. Jung? I realise I've never said that word out loud. I'm going to say Jung. Jung? Again, feel free to tell me which one is correct. But I was recently at a conference with a lot of fans of Jordan Peterson, and they talked about how influenced Jordan Peterson is by Jung and Jungian archetypes. I'm going to go with Jung. We've had an interview this series with a guy called Jeffrey Boakye, who is a writer and a teacher and a musician, and writes a lot about kind of race and colonialism. And he was talking about Jungian archetypes as well. And it feels like it's a kind of intellectual underground stream for a lot of different people and a lot of different bodies of thought that I'd probably be able to make more sense of them if I knew more about it. But yes, men and women, he did such a good job, didn't he, of like avoiding the landmines and saying the yes and. The yes, within Druid thought, there is a kind of the spear and the chalice, and that those have often been linked with masculine and feminine spirit or masculine and feminine energy, but that when we try and shrink them down into sort of male and female biology, something's been lost and is also potentially therefore more difficult for a wide range of people to engage in. And finally, the rejection of sexual constraint. And again, this came up with Tim Winter, and I wonder if there's a 60s and 70s thing going on. There is a particular generational thing going on where sexual freedom was almost became a kind of sacred value of like the future in the 60s, of the modern man or woman, that the idea that you would not just follow all your sexual desires did become kind of offensive, and in some forms is definitely, there's very unhealthy versions of it. But my tradition, and I think a lot of traditions, a lot of wisdom traditions have encouraged us just to really take sex seriously and take it seriously as spiritually relevant, and as a site where we can either grow up our souls or shrink them, and particularly a place where we can harm other people, where we can fail to love our neighbours through a lack of sexual restraint or constraint. I think Philip is absolutely right that it is one of the hard things for people to get over with the more Abrahamic faiths, or at least with Islam and Christianity. And so I loved his honesty of saying like part of the Druidry is just a slightly different attitude to the question of sex. I love that he actually was the chief Druid. He just didn't really like the title. Thank you so much for listening to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values of a wide range of people who are shaping our common life. Our production team are Lizzie Harvey, Amari Gandran, Lydia Taylor, and Joe Downey. Our music is by Luke Stanley. Please come and check out the wider work of Theos. We make another podcast called Reading Our Times. Beautiful animations, research reports, loads and loads of good stuff to get dug into. So I hope you'll check out the website at theosthinktank.co.uk, and I will speak to you next time.